James Peterson stared out the airplane window as his flight descended into London Heathrow Airport. The 28-year-old American tourist had spent the last 3 days partying across Amsterdam and Paris, leaving a trail of wild stories behind him. His Instagram feed was filled with photos of him doing shots at famous bars and striking poses in front of European landmarks, usually with a drink in hand. "Sir, please fasten your seatbelt. We're landing soon." The flight attendant's voice broke through his hungover haze. James nodded, fumbling with the buckle as his head throbbed. He hadn't even bothered sleeping the night before, heading straight to the Paris airport after leaving a nightclub at 4 a.m. His phone buzzed with messages from his travel group. 5 other Americans he'd met through a European party tour company. They had arrived in London yesterday and were waiting for him at their hostel near Piccadilly Circus. "Dude, you won't believe the pub crawl they do here." Read a text from Mike, one of his new friends. "But heads up, the cops are way stricter about drunk tourists than in Amsterdam." James smirked as he typed back, "Whatever, man. British police are just for show with those funny hats. What are they gonna do, hate me with their umbrellas?" He added a crying laughing emoji and sent it. The plane touched down with a jolt that made his stomach lurch. James couldn't wait to get to his hotel and take some aspirin before meeting up with his friends. As he walked through the airport, he passed a gift shop with royal family merchandise in the window. Postcards showed the famous Queen's Guards in their red uniforms and tall bearskin hats. "Those guys must be dying in those outfits," he muttered to himself, thinking about the summer heat outside. "Bet they're not allowed to even swat a fly." After collecting his backpack from baggage claim, James made his way to the underground station. He barely slept in 3 days, but the thought of missing out on any partying kept him going. The train car swayed as he checked his itinerary. His group had planned to watch the changing of the guard ceremony at Buckingham Palace before hitting the pubs. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Sarah, another tourist from his group. "James, seriously, they're super strict about behavior near the palace. No getting too close to the guards or making fun of them. Some guy got arrested last week for just touching one of their hats." "Challenge accepted," James typed back with a grinning emoji, even though he was mostly joking. He'd learned from his dad, a history teacher, that the Queen's Guards were actually elite soldiers, not just tourist attractions. But 3 days of non-stop partying had left him feeling invincible. The hostel was crowded when he arrived, full of young backpackers from around the world. James spotted Mike in the common room and dropped his bag. "There's our party animal," Mike called out. "Ready for some proper British pubs?" "Let me at least take a shower first," James said, running a hand through his messy brown hair. "I probably smell like every bar in Paris." Up in his shared room, James changed into fresh clothes and popped some painkillers. Looking in the mirror, he saw the dark circles under his green eyes but chose to ignore them. The excitement of being in London was already pushing away his exhaustion. Back in the common room, he found his whole group waiting. Besides Mike and Sarah, there was Tom, Rachel, and Katie, all Americans in their 20s looking for adventure in Europe. "So what's the plan?" James asked, throwing himself onto a worn couch. "Changing of the guard at 11, then lunch at this amazing pub near the palace," Sarah explained. "But seriously, James, you have to behave. The guards are real soldiers and they don't mess around." "You guys worry too much," James said with a dismissive wave. "I'm just here to have fun and get some cool photos. What's the worst that could happen?" As they headed out into the London sunshine, none of them could have predicted how that casual question would be answered in just a few hours. James walked through the crowded streets, already planning which pubs they'd hit after seeing the guards. The combination of sleep deprivation, lingering alcohol in his system, and an inflated sense of invulnerability was about to create a perfect storm. A street vendor was selling beer from a cart, and James couldn't resist buying one for the walk. "Hair of the dog," he explained to his friends' disapproving looks. "Besides, I want to experience real British beer." Little did he know, that innocent-looking can of beer would soon become evidence in a case that would change his entire life. The summer heat beat down on London streets as James and his friends made their way toward Buckingham Palace. Despite the early hour, sweat was already forming on his forehead. The can of beer in his hand was half empty, and its effects were mixing dangerously with his exhaustion and lingering hangover. "We should get there early to get a good spot," Sarah suggested, checking the time on her phone. "The crowds get crazy during the changing of the guard." James took another long drink from his beer. The world had taken on that familiar fuzzy edge he'd been chasing since Amsterdam. Around him, tourists were already gathering, their cameras ready and excitement building in the morning air. "You know what's funny?" James said loudly to his friends, drawing disapproving looks from a nearby British family. "These guards just stand there all day like statues. Like, what's even the point?" Mike grabbed his arm and pulled him aside. "Dude, lower your voice. There are cops everywhere around here." Indeed, uniformed police officers were visible at regular intervals along the palace fence. But in James's alcohol-clouded mind, they just added to the theatrical nature of it all. He finished his beer and crushed the can, looking for a trash bin. The crowd was growing thicker now. Tour guides speaking various languages led groups of visitors into position, explaining the history and significance of the ceremony. James found himself pushed closer to the front by the surge of people, his friends getting separated in the crowd. "James!" Sarah called from a few feet away. "Come back here, you're too close to the guard path." But James was fascinated by the guard standing perfectly still nearby. The soldier's red uniform seemed to glow in the sunlight, and despite the heat, there wasn't a single bead of sweat visible on his face. The famous bearskin hat added nearly 2 feet to his height, making him an imposing figure. A group of Japanese tourists next to James were taking selfies, careful to maintain a respectful distance from the guard. James watched as they bowed slightly after taking their photos, showing a level of respect that his intoxicated mind found amusing. "Hey Mike," he called out, pulling out his phone. "Watch this. I'm gonna get the best photo of the day." The crushed beer can was still in his other hand as he started making faces near the guard, trying to provoke a reaction. The guard remained perfectly still, staring straight ahead as he was trained to do. "Sir, please step back," a police officer called out, starting to walk in James's direction. The heat, the alcohol, and 3 days of nearly no sleep had created a perfect storm in James's mind. He felt invincible, like the main character in a movie about wild European adventures. The warning voice in his head that usually stopped him from doing anything too stupid had been silenced by countless drinks across 3 countries. "Come on, man," James called to the guard. "You must be dying in that fur hat. It's like 100 degrees out here." Sarah pushed through the crowd, trying to reach him. "James, stop it right now." But James was on a roll. Other tourists had started filming him, some laughing, others looking concerned. The police officer was getting closer, his walk becoming more purposeful. "I bet you're not even a real soldier," James said, swaying slightly as he moved even closer to the guard. "This is all just for the tourists, right?" The guard's face remained impassive, but there was a subtle tension in his jaw now. Years of military training were being tested by one drunk American tourist who didn't know when to stop. Mike finally reached James and grabbed his shoulder. "That's enough, man. Let's go find a pub." Wait, James slurred, shrugging off Mike's hand. "I want to see if these guys are robots or something. They can't be real people." The crowd had grown larger now, attracted by the spectacle. Phones were recording from every angle, and the police officer was now just yards away. The morning sun continued to beat down, and James could feel sweat soaking through his t-shirt. In his alcohol-addled mind, a terrible idea was taking shape. The crushed beer can felt heavy in his hand as he looked at the guard's perfectly pressed uniform. A small voice in the back of his head tried one last time to stop him, but it was drowned out by the cheers and laughter he imagined would follow his next action. No one in the crowd could have predicted what would happen next, or how quickly a tourist's drunken prank would turn into an international incident. Time seemed to slow down as James's arm moved backward, the crushed beer can still containing enough liquid to make it dangerous. The crowd around him gasped collectively, sensing what was about to happen. Sarah's scream of "no" came a split second too late. With the poor judgment that only comes from a dangerous mixture of alcohol, exhaustion, and misplaced bravado, James launched the beer can through the air. The aluminum projectile spun in a graceless arc, glistening with drops of warm beer catching the sunlight. The guard saw it coming in his peripheral vision but maintained his position, exactly as his training dictated. The gun struck his chest, exploding in a spray of warm beer that soaked his immaculate red tunic. The dark liquid created an expanding stain across the bright fabric, dripping down onto his polished boots. For one surreal moment, absolute silence fell over the crowd. Hundreds of phones captured the scene from every angle, their owners too shocked to even gasp. The guard remained perfectly still, beer dripping from his uniform, his face a mask of military discipline, even in the face of this direct assault. James stood there with his arms still extended from the throw, a stupid grin frozen on his face as his alcohol-addled brain tried to process what he'd just done. Then reality came crashing back in waves. The first wave was sound, screams, shouts, and the sharp whistle blasts of nearby police officers. The second wave was movement. Tourists scrambling backward, creating a circle of empty space around James. The third wave was the most dramatic, 4 Metropolitan Police officers converging on him from different directions, moving with practiced precision. It was just a joke? James shouted, finally realizing the magnitude of his mistake. He tried to step backward but stumbled, his intoxication making him clumsy. Come on, it's not that serious. But it was that serious. 2 armed Queen's Guard soldiers had appeared as if from nowhere, taking positions beside their soaked colleague. Their faces showed none of the ceremonial stoicism now. These were trained military personnel responding to an attack on one of their own. On the ground, the command came from multiple officers at once. James felt strong hands on his shoulders, forcing him down onto the hot pavement. The same tourists who had been filming his antics moments ago were now recording his arrest, their phones capturing every second of his humiliation. Sarah was crying somewhere in the background. Mike was trying to explain to an officer that they weren't involved. The guard who had been hit remained at his post, dignity intact despite his soaked uniform, a living testament to military discipline. "You are under arrest for assault on a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces," an officer announced clearly, loud enough for the surrounding phones to pick up. The handcuffs clicked shut around James's wrists, cold metal shocking him into a moment of clarity. "I wasn't trying to," James stammered, but the words dried up in his throat. From his position on the ground, he could see the beer stain on the guard's uniform spreading, dark against the red fabric. The reality of what he'd done was finally breaking through his drunken haze. Police radios crackled with urgent communications. More officers were arriving, creating a perimeter to control the growing crowd. Tourist guides were hurriedly moving their groups away, already adapting their scripts to include warnings about the consequences of disrespecting the Queen's Guard. As James was pulled to his feet, he caught a glimpse of his friends' faces. Sarah was being comforted by Katie, both looking shocked and tearful. Mike and Tom stood with their hands on their heads, being questioned by officers. Rachel was nowhere to be seen, having disappeared into the crowd at the first sign of trouble. "Please." James tried one more time as he was led toward a waiting police van. "It was just a stupid mistake. I'm an American citizen." "That won't help you here, mate," one of the officers responded grimly. "You've really done it now." The van's doors slammed shut behind him, cutting off the sound of the crowd and the sight of Buckingham Palace. Through the small window, James could see his beer-soaked victim still standing at attention, a perfect soldier even in the face of such disrespect. The van started moving, and with it, the realization that his European vacation had just turned into something far more serious. The famous London landmarks he'd been so excited to see pass by the window, but James was no longer a tourist. He was now a criminal in custody, about to learn just how seriously the British legal system took attacks on its ceremonial guards. The police van sped through London's streets, its siren cutting through the morning traffic. Inside, James sat with his head in his handcuffed hands, the gravity of his situation finally penetrating his alcohol-fogged mind. 2 officers sat across from him, their faces showing no sympathy for his increasingly panicked state. "My passport. I need to call the American embassy," James mumbled, his voice shaking. The officers exchanged knowing looks but remained silent. At the police station, James was led through a series of heavy doors, each one closing behind him with an ominous click. The processing area buzzed with activity, but everything seemed to pause momentarily as he was brought in. Word had already spread about the tourist who'd attacked a Queen's Guard. "Name?" the booking officer asked, though she clearly already knew. James' action had been broadcast across social media within minutes of his arrest. "James Peterson," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The hangover was hitting him hard now, combined with the sickening realization of what he'd done. "American passport holder, tourist visa," the officer noted, typing into her computer. "Charged with assault on a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces, disorderly conduct at a protected royal site, and public intoxication." James's belongings were catalogued and sealed in plastic bags: his phone, wallet, watch, and the hostel key he'd received just hours ago. His shoelaces were removed, and he was photographed from multiple angles, the flash of the camera making him wince. In another room, detectives were reviewing the countless videos of the incident already flooding social media. The footage was damning, showing James's escalating behavior, the warnings he'd ignored, and the deliberate act of throwing the beer can. News websites were already running the story, with headlines growing more sensational by the minute. "The American embassy has been notified," an officer informed him as he was led to a holding cell. "But given the nature of your offense, this will be handled through our courts." The cell was small and cold, with a single bench and a steel toilet. James sat down, his head spinning. Through the small window in the door, he could see officers hurrying past, phones ringing constantly in the background. Meanwhile, back at Buckingham Palace, the scene had evolved into controlled chaos. The soaked guard had been ceremonially relieved of duty, his uniform documented as evidence. Senior military officers had arrived to take statements, their presence underlining the seriousness of the incident. James's friends were still being questioned, their phones temporarily confiscated to preserve their video evidence. Sarah sat on a bench, tears streaming down her face as she gave her statement. "We tried to stop him," she explained to a sympathetic female officer. "He hadn't slept in days, and he'd been drinking since Amsterdam." Mike was more direct in his statement. "Look, James is an idiot, but he's not a bad guy. He didn't understand what those guards really are. He thought it was all just for show." Social media was exploding with the story. The videos were being shared thousands of times per minute, with comments ranging from outrage to disbelief. News crews had arrived at the palace, setting up cameras and interviewing tourists who witnessed the incident. Back in the holding cell, James had started to sober up, and with clarity came terror. His phone call to his parents in Minnesota had been brief and devastating. "Dad, I really messed up," he'd managed to say before breaking down. His father, the history teacher who taught him about British traditions, remained silent for a long moment before speaking. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" his father had asked quietly. "Those guards are active duty soldiers. This isn't just some tourist prank, son." Now, sitting alone in his cell, James could hear snippets of conversation from passing officers. Words like fast-track prosecution and making an example drifted through the door. His tourist visa had already been revoked, and his passport was being held by the authorities. A new officer appeared at his cell door, looking stern. "The magistrate is ready to see you now," he announced. "Given the public nature of your offense and the clear evidence, your case is being expedited." James stood on shaky legs, his adventure in Europe having transformed from a carefree vacation into a legal nightmare in less than an hour. As he was led toward the courthouse, he couldn't help but think about that beer can, spitting through the air in the summer sun, and how that one moment of drunken stupidity was about to change his life forever. The courthouse hallway echoed with hurried footsteps as James was led toward the magistrate's chambers. His court-appointed lawyer, Mr. Thompson, had arrived just minutes earlier, barely having time to review the case files that were growing thicker by the minute. "This is highly unusual," Mr. Thompson muttered, flipping through papers as they walked. "They're fast-tracking your case. Someone up high wants this dealt with immediately." James, now completely sober and pale with fear, watched as more evidence arrived in the hands of rushing clerks. His phone had been examined, revealing his text messages joking about the guards and dismissing his friend's warnings. Each message now read like another nail in his legal coffin. In a small conference room, Mr. Thompson laid out the situation bluntly. "The evidence against you is overwhelming. We had multiple video angles, hundreds of witnesses, and your own social media posts showing premeditation. The prosecution is pushing for the maximum sentence." "Maximum?" James croaked, his throat dry. "How long is that?" "For assault on a member of the armed forces at a protected royal site, Up to 2 years. Mr. Thompson adjusted his glasses. And they're treating this very seriously. The guard you attacked was a decorated combat veteran. The news hit James like a physical blow. The man he humiliated wasn't just a tourist attraction. He was a soldier who'd served in actual combat. The beer stain he caused wasn't just on a costume, but on a uniform earned through years of service. Outside the conference room, the legal machinery was moving at unprecedented speed. The Crown Prosecution Service had assembled a team in record time, determined to make an example of this case. Photos of the soaked guard's uniform had been submitted as evidence, along with a detailed report of the cleaning costs and the disruption to the ceremonial schedule. Your friends have provided statements, Mr. Thompson continued, reading from his tablet, that confirmed you were warned repeatedly about appropriate behavior. The pub vendor who sold you the beer has identified you. Even the airline has submitted records showing you were drinking on the flight from Paris. James slumped in his chair, remembering how invincible he'd felt just hours ago. Now each piece of evidence felt like another stone in an avalanche burying him. A court officer appeared at the door. They're ready for him now. In another room, prosecutors were preparing their case with military efficiency. The incident had become more than just a drunk tourist's mistake. It was being treated as an attack on a British institution. Statements had arrived from military officials, palace authorities, and even tourism boards, all calling for severe consequences. James's phone buzzed on the evidence table, displaying calls from American news networks already pursuing the story. His face was on news websites worldwide, freeze-framed in the moment of throwing the beer can. The American embassy had sent a representative, but their power was limited given the clear evidence and the public nature of the offense. Listen carefully, Mr. Thompson said, closing the door for privacy. The magistrate is willing to hear your case immediately. Given the circumstances, I recommend pleading guilty. A show of immediate remorse might help reduce the sentence. But I can't go to prison, James whispered, thinking of his job back home, his apartment, his life. I'm supposed to fly back next week. That flight's not happening, Mr. Thompson replied grimly. Your tourist visa has been cancelled. The only question now is how long you'll be staying in Her Majesty's prison system. Through the window, James could see news vans arriving outside the courthouse. His story was growing bigger by the minute, becoming a symbol of disrespect toward British institutions. Social media was flooded with opinions, most of them calling for harsh punishment. A clock on the wall showed it had been just 45 minutes since his arrest. In less than an hour, he'd gone from being a carefree tourist to facing serious prison time. The beer that had given him such false courage was long gone, leaving only a headache and crushing regret. It's time, the court officer announced, returning to the room. The magistrate will see you now. James stood on shaking legs, straightening his wrinkled clothes as best he could. As he walked toward the courtroom, he could hear the murmur of gathered press and public, all waiting to see justice dealt to the American who dared to assault a Queen's Guard. The magistrate's courtroom fell silent as James entered, his footsteps echoing against the wooden floor. Every seat in the public gallery was filled with journalists, their pens poised over notepads. In the front row sat his friends, looking shell-shocked, with Sarah still wiping tears from her eyes. Magistrate Eleanor Hughes peered down at James from her elevated position, her expression stern. At 58, she had seen thousands of cases, but few had gathered such immediate public attention. The courtroom clock showed it had been exactly 52 minutes since the incident. James Peterson, she announced, her voice carrying clear authority. You're charged with assault on a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces, disorderly conduct at a protected royal site, and public intoxication. How do you plead? James glanced at Mr. Thompson, who nodded slightly. Guilty, Your Honor, he managed to say, his voice barely audible. The prosecutor, a sharp-featured woman named Ms. Blackwood, rose to her feet. Your Honor, we present evidence of a deliberate and public attack on Guard Sergeant David Mitchell, a decorated veteran with 12 years of service, including 2 tours in Afghanistan. The courtroom screen displayed the video footage, now seen by millions online. James couldn't bear to watch himself, but he couldn't block out the collective gasp from the gallery as the beer struck the guard's uniform. The defendant had been repeatedly warned about his behavior. Ms. Blackwood continued. We have statements from multiple witnesses, including his own traveling companions, confirming that he was explicitly told about the serious nature of interfering with the Queen's Guard. She produced printouts of James's text messages, reading them aloud. His mocking words about the guards being just for show echoed through the silent courtroom. James felt himself shrinking into his chair with each damning piece of evidence. Mr. Thompson stood for the defense, doing his best with an impossible case. Your Honor, my client acknowledges his grave error in judgment. He was under the influence of alcohol and suffering from sleep deprivation. He deeply regrets his actions and wishes to apologize to Sergeant Mitchell and the entire British Armed Forces. Would the defendant like to address the court? Magistrate Hughes asked, her gaze fixed on James. Standing on trembling legs, James faced the court. I'm so sorry, he began, his voice cracking. I didn't understand who they were, what they represented. I treated everything like a joke, and I disrespected a real soldier, a veteran. I can't take it back, but I wish I could. The magistrate listened impassively, then turned to examine new documents placed before her. Reports from military officials, statements from palace authorities, and diplomatic notes from both British and American officials covered her desk. This court has received numerous calls for severe punishment, she stated. The footage of your attack has gone viral, Mr. Peterson. At a time when respect for our institutions is already under strain, your actions have caused significant damage to the dignity of our armed forces and our royal traditions. James noticed more people entering the courtroom. Military officers in full-dress uniform took seats near the front, their presence adding weight to the proceedings. A representative from the American embassy sat quietly in the corner, powerless to intervene. Ms. Blackwood rose again. The Crown seeks maximum penalties, Your Honor. This case requires a strong message about the consequences of assaulting our servicemen, regardless of the perpetrator's nationality. The magistrate nodded, reviewing one final document before looking up. The courtroom held its breath, waiting for her decision. Outside, the crowd of reporters had grown, their cameras ready to capture James's exit, whether as a free man or a prisoner. Before I pass sentence, Magistrate Hughes said, I want to note that Sergeant Mitchell has remained at attention throughout this incident, despite the assault and humiliation. His conduct represents the highest standards of British military discipline. She paused, fixing James with a stern gaze. Your behavior, Mr. Peterson, represents the exact opposite. James stood again, awaiting his fate. In less than an hour, he had become an international symbol of disrespect, his actions captured forever on countless videos. The magnitude of his mistake weighed heavily on him as the magistrate prepared to announce his sentence. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the final moments of James Peterson's freedom. Magistrate Hughes cleared her throat, the sound echoing through the silent courtroom. It had been exactly 58 minutes since James had thrown that fateful beer can at Buckingham Palace. James Peterson, she began, her voice firm and clear. This court views your actions with the utmost severity. You came to our country as a guest, and you chose to assault a decorated member of our armed forces while he performed his ceremonial duties. She lifted a paper, reading from the guard sergeant's service record. The man you attacked has served this nation with distinction for 12 years. While you treated him as a tourist attraction, he has risked his life in active combat and earned every thread of the uniform you soaked with beer. James stood trembling, his legs barely supporting him. Behind him, you could hear Sarah's muffled sobs and the furious scratching of journalists' pens. Taking into account your immediate guilty plea, the magistrate continued, but also considering the public nature of your offense and the need to deter similar behavior, I sentence you to 1 year in Her Majesty's prison system. The words hit James like a physical blow. 1 year. His knees buckled slightly, and Mr. Thompson grabbed his arm to steady him. Additionally, the magistrate went on, you are ordered to pay £2,000 in fines and compensation for the damage to the ceremonial uniform. Your tourist visa is hereby revoked, and you will be prohibited from entering the United Kingdom for 10 years following your release. The journalists rushed from the courtroom, racing to be the first to report the sentence. Within seconds, news alerts would be buzzing on phones across the globe. American tourist jailed for beer attack on Queen's Guard. 2 prison officers approached James as the magistrate continued reading the terms of his sentence. His friends watched helplessly as handcuffs were placed on his wrists once again. Your belongings will be returned to your family, One officer explained quietly, "You're being transferred to HMP Wandsworth immediately." Mr. Thompson spoke quickly as James was led away. "I'll visit you tomorrow to discuss appeal options, but given the evidence, I must be honest about our chances." James caught one last glimpse of his friends as he was led through a side door. They had gone from being his party companions to witnesses against him in less than an hour. Mike raised a hand in a weak farewell gesture, his face pale with shock. Outside the courthouse, a police van waited to transport him to prison. Through its windows, James could see the crowd of reporters and photographers, their cameras flashing like strobe lights. His face would be on every news website and newspaper the next day, a cautionary tale for tourists worldwide. In his cell at HMP Wandsworth that evening, James sat on the narrow bed, still struggling to process how quickly his life had changed. His phone call to his parents had been brief and painful. "We'll do everything we can," his father had promised, his voice thick with emotion. "But son, you got to face the consequences of your actions." The prison officer who brought his dinner looked at him with a mix of curiosity and disapproval. "You're the one who threw beer at the Queen's Guard, aren't you?" he asked, shaking his head. "Famous already, you are. The whole prison's talking about it." James didn't respond, staring instead at the grey walls of his cell. His European vacation had turned into a year-long stay in a British prison, all because of one drunken moment of disrespect. Back at Buckingham Palace, the day's ceremonies continued as usual. Sergeant Mitchell, in a fresh uniform, stood at his post with perfect military bearing. Tourists still took photos, but now they stayed well back from the guards, the story of the jailed American fresh in their minds. In just 58 minutes, James Peterson had gone from being a carefree tourist to a convicted criminal. His story would be told in guidebooks and tourist warnings for years to come. As night fell over London, he lay on his prison bed, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. The beer can that had seemed so funny to throw had cost him a year of his life, thousands of pounds, and his ability to return to the UK for a decade. The sound of the prison's heavy doors locking echoed through the corridors, marking the end of James Peterson's first day of 365 behind bars.